The Republican Party, as it came to exist after 1980 or so, was much different from the Republican Party that had existed for many decades prior to that time. There was a major progressive strain within the Republican Party for decades that seemed to start, as best as I can determine, with Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was much more in line with common ordinary people than a lot of the Republicans of that era, and then, of course, the conservative movement that came to exist many years later after 1980. Theodore Roosevelt wanted a square deal for business and labor, and he took some action with regard to that goal. He was a conservationist, which came to be kind of a bad word. Conservation did with a lot of Republicans later on. He was very much involved with trust busting, breaking up big business monopolies because of the damage that they could do to consumers and to smaller businesses. Then when Dwight Eisenhower came along in 1952, he didn't try to unscramble all the eggs that had been scrambled during the New Deal. In fact, he expanded upon some of the things that happened during the New Deal. There were minimum wage increases under Eisenhower. The Social Security program saw a major expansion so that people were covered who had not been previously covered under Social Security. And one of the biggest of all, the interstate highway system dwarfed any single project that had ever existed in the New Deal. And the interstate highway system is a program that has affected everybody. Unless you're just a person who never goes anywhere, you're pretty much affected by the interstate highway system. They have these sleek, modern highways that were developed that made travel a lot easier, long distance travel in particular, but people also use them to travel across metros. And so it made travel a lot easier, and businesses would spring up around these exits. You'd see hotels, motels, restaurants, and similar businesses that cater to travelers. I'll never forget one time I was discussing Eisenhower with this person who told me that Eisenhower didn't really do very much, and the strange thing was we were standing at an interstate exit, an exit off the interstate highway system where people would get on and off the interstate. And so I said, well, the thing about it is that interstate highway system over there wouldn't exist if it weren't for him. That has affected life in a lot of ways, and very positive ways for a lot of people. So you had that interstate highway system, which was a tremendous boon to modern life in many ways. Then the Nixon administration came along, with Nixon being elected in 1968, and you see that progressive strain continuing in some of the following ways. The Environmental Protection Agency was created. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, was passed, creating the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, known as OSHA. Nixon at one point imposed a wage and price freeze. There was a revenue sharing program, sharing federal tax dollars with states to accomplish projects in the states that the states and local governments deemed worthy. There was a strong commitment to the space program throughout the Nixon years. He would often make telephone calls to the astronauts who were orbiting Earth or in the moon or various places. The Nixon administration began working on getting the United States out of Vietnam, which was, of course, an extremely unpopular war, and that didn't consummate until the Ford administration came in, but eventually the U.S. did get out of Vietnam. And here is a big one. During the Nixon administration, it saw the creation of the Supplemental Security Income SSI program. And what that is, it creates an income stream for people who have never been able to work. And a lot of those people would not have an income if it wasn't for this program that was created during the Nixon administration to help people who have been completely disabled from working from their entire lives. And I have no doubt that before this program was created, there were probably people who starved to death because they were never able to work and they had nobody to help them out. So the SSI program was a tremendously progressive thing that happened during the Richard Nixon administration. Of course, the Carter administration came along, and a lot of people saw the Carter administration as weak in dealing with the Soviet Union, which was a huge threat at the time. So a lot of people were concerned with what they saw as, weakness, and there was the Iran hostage crisis and so forth. And there were some significant economic problems during the Carter administration that had a lot of people really not happy. But the fact is, and I didn't know this until a lot later, that 8 million jobs were created during the Carter years, and the Bush administration, under that administration, George W. Bush, only about 5 million or so jobs were created in 8 years. So Carter did better than 4 than George W. Bush did in 8, although there were some tremendously serious problems with inflation and high interest rates. But then in 1980, a new movement took control of the Republican Party. It is known as the conservative movement. And their argument was that small government is always better government. And we have to have limited government and low taxes. And those tax cuts were going to be a key thing that spurred the economy and got it out of a very long recession. So the Economic Recovery Tax Act and the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act were passed. Well, what did happen was that the United States began to climb out of the recession in about January of 1983. But what nobody tells you these days is that that recovery, that expansion, was long, slow, and painful. It took about 6 damn years for the unemployment rate to get below 6%. So although there was growth in the gross domestic product, it was increasing, that national unemployment rate was extremely slow to come down. And in the state of Alabama where I was, it never got below about 7.5% until about 13 years later. So the South, a lot of southern states, remained extremely poor during that time. But I was one of those progressive Republicans who supported the kind of things that previous administrations had done, like Teddy Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, and Richard Nixon. And although Reagan was involved in a lot of budget cuts or cutting the increase in the federal budget, I did not see at that time that people were being harmed, because during the Reagan years I knew people who were in public housing, who were getting Pell Grants, and who were on food stamps, and who were getting commodity distributions about every month or so, free huge blocks of cheese and things like that. So it looked like to me that low-income people who were suffering were getting plenty of help during the Reagan years. So I remained a Republican for a long time because I was one of those progressive Republicans who supported all the things that I just mentioned. But at the end of the Bill Clinton administration, the economy went into a slump, and the George W. Bush administration comes in, and the first thing they do is they want to get back to conservatism. They want to get back to Reaganism. So they enact these huge tax cuts, the largest tax cuts that had ever been enacted up to that point, and yet the recovery that happened after that just created a lot of low-wage, unstable jobs, and you had a situation where multiple millions of people were locked in these low-wage, unstable jobs. And in spite of the fact that the gross domestic product started growing again, you had an awful lot of people in the United States who were really suffering under this so-called George W. Bush prosperity. A key component of conservatism was that businesses ought to be allowed to do whatever businesses wanted to do, and boy, they did, didn't they? They sent jobs overseas. They eliminated good jobs. They replaced them with low-paying jobs. They would pay people to retire, and then the replacements wouldn't make nearly as much. And one thing that was contributing to that, I believe, were trade policies and eventually uncontrolled immigration. There was this collusion between Bill Clinton and Rush Limbaugh, the conservatives, in the early to mid-1990s to enact NAFTA, and from that point forward it seemed that there was this huge attack on wage earners from both the Republicans and the Democrats. Well, conservatism under George W. Bush didn't work. There were a lot of jobs created, but it wasn't nearly the number of jobs that were created under the Carter administration. In spite of the fact that the gross domestic product was going, an awful lot of people were suffering. And then in the recession that followed the financial panic of 2008, actually the recession started in December of 2007, you had a lot of people who became unemployed. But from the conservatives, what you were hearing were these merciless attacks on the unemployed and the poor. The Bush administration in 2004 had changed the overtime rules so that people making $23,000, if they were defined as some kind of supervisor or manager, would be exempt from the overtime rules. And sadly, that isn't going to be fixed, it looked like. So you had conservatism in control, and yet you had terrible things going on in the business community. People just trapped in these low-wage jobs everywhere. I mean, hundreds of millions of people. And so George W. Bush's popularity was really bad. And it seemed like a lot of corporations and a lot of companies just ran riot. And so it became obvious to me by the end of the 2008 election cycle that this doesn't work. These people don't know what the hell they're doing. So I voted for Barack Obama, and I supported him twice. Okay, some good things happened, and the most important good thing probably that happened was the stimulus program, which in effect did get the government, the economy moving, and there were some good things on the environmental front, and so there were a number of good things that came out of it. They made an effort to assist people during the recovery from the Great Recession by extending unemployment benefits and allowing people, making it easier for people to get into COBRA, and a number of good things that did come about. At the Affordable Care Act, though, they really made a mess there, because although some people benefited a lot, other people didn't benefit at all. And in fact, for people, there were people who got helped, but there were also people that got hurt. And the thing that never really came about during the Obama administration was a strategy to promote good-paying jobs. Now, I agreed with the Democrats that there were needs to do things like raise the minimum wage and expand health insurance. I agreed with them, and change the overtime protection laws. I agreed with that stuff, but still, there never seemed to come into focus any way to generate good-paying jobs or retain them here in the United States, and that is a huge problem that weighed down. That's one thing that weighed down Hillary Clinton. And there was also this focus, it seemed like a little bit too much focus on this, that, and the other group. And since the NAFTA era, wage workers were just getting pummeled by both Republicans and Democrats. So you have the 2016 election, and in that election I supported Bernie Sanders for the Democratic nomination, because I thought that he had proposed a lot of things that were really going to be great. And of course he would have had to have a Democratic Congress. And you know, the college education thing, the working on free trade, the universal health care, there were so many things that would have worked well, but he ultimately lost. So then Hillary Clinton was going to get nominated, and the problem with Hillary, for one thing, it was going to be a Republican Congress. There was no doubt about that. The House was never in dispute, and it was going to be a Republican Congress, and you were going to have, in a country where a lot of drastic things need to be done, you're going to have a situation where essentially nothing was going to get done, because the Republican Congress majority would not allow Hillary Clinton to do anything. And then she was also in that free trade camp, you know, NAFTA, and these trade policies that had damaged the white working class in particular so much. And so in the 2016 election, you had a lot of white working class voters who went to Trump because he proposed things like infrastructure. And if a huge infrastructure bill actually goes through and the infrastructure actually gets done, that's going to be tremendously helpful. Border control, like it or not, no country can take in an unlimited number of people. No country can, the United States or any other. Then fair trade. Finally, people found somebody who was on their side with fair trade. And so those are three things that might actually work with the Trump administration when the Obama administration had no real strategy for new jobs. And so although I wrote in Jerry Brown, I was actually happier to see Trump win than I was Clinton, because I knew that was going to be 8 years gridlock, which puts me in a bit of a situation now. How do I identify myself politically? Well, I'm not really comfortable with liberal or conservative anymore. I'm not affiliated with a party anymore, because I want real solutions, and I think there are terrible problems with both of these parties, with the Clinton, the Clintonistas, and also the conservative movement. And I found myself being happier that Trump won than Clinton. So what do I call myself now? Well, I'm politically independent. And the best description that I can use to describe myself, wanting policies that work for most people and struggling to find them in either party, is I am a malcontent, a maverick, and a rogue. And that's what I'll have to call myself for the foreseeable future, in case you wanted to know.